Ethan walked down the street with his trash bag slung over his shoulder, the cool evening air doing little to calm the storm inside him. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of years of disappointment and rejection had finally caught up to him. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't go back. The house that had once been a home now felt like a prison he had escaped, but the freedom was bitter and uncertain. He spent that night in his old car, parked under a flickering street lamp. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, and when it did, his dreams were haunted by echoes of his parents' words. Ethan tried not to cry, tried to convince himself that leaving was the only way to survive, but the tears came anyway. They weren't just about being kicked out, they were about the years he had tried and failed to be enough for them, about the love that had never been returned. Morning brought no relief. Ethan counted the money in his wallet, barely enough for bus fare, let alone food. He swallowed his pride and called his best friend from high school, Marcus, who immediately invited him over. Marcus didn't ask questions, he didn't judge. He handed Ethan a warm cup of coffee and a couch to sleep on. That simple act of kindness made Ethan realize that some people could see value in him even when his own family could not. Days turned into weeks. Ethan got a part-time job at a local hardware store, working long hours stacking shelves and helping customers. Every night, he pored over college textbooks, refusing to let his education slip away despite the exhaustion gnawing at him. Each paycheck was split carefully, rent for the tiny apartment he found, food, and a small savings account that felt like planting seeds for a future he couldn't yet see. At work, Ethan noticed small opportunities. He listened to the contractors who came in, memorized the tools, and learned the trade. Slowly, he discovered that while he had been denied support at home, he could build his own foundation elsewhere. He realized that independence wasn't just leaving his parents' house, it was creating a life that couldn't be taken away, no matter how cruel the past had been. Months passed, and Ethan began to dream again. He imagined owning his own home, a place where he could feel safe, respected, and proud. He imagined walking into a house not because someone handed it to him, but because he had earned it through determination, hard work, and resilience. Every time he felt the sting of his parents' betrayal, he let it fuel him instead of holding him back. And with every passing day, the thought of that old house, the one his parents had once closed the door on, lingered in his mind. Not as a place of pain, but as a challenge. He promised himself that one day, he would stand in that living room again, but this time on his own terms, holding the keys to a life they could never take away. Ethan sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the faded wallpaper and peeling paint. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to a house filled with rules he could never meet and praise he could never earn. His younger brother, Kyle, seemed to do everything right. Teachers loved him. Friends admired him. And their parents, they made sure Kyle knew how proud they were every single day. Ethan remembered birthdays where Kyle got the big parties while he got a quiet dinner and a small, almost forgettable gift. He remembered school achievements that went unnoticed, homework projects that were dismissed with a shrug. Every time he tried to speak up or share something he had done, it was met with criticism. "You could have done better," they would say. "Why can't you be more like Kyle?" It wasn't just about fairness, it was about love being conditional. Ethan learned early that no matter how hard he tried, he was always falling short in their eyes. He became quiet, careful with his words, afraid to make mistakes that might trigger anger. He learned to survive on the margins, to blend into the background while Kyle shone in the spotlight. Even small moments of happiness were stolen from him. He remembered a family trip when he had won a small award at school. Instead of celebrating him, his parents barely looked up from their conversation about Kyle's soccer game. Ethan felt invisible. That invisibility followed him into his teenage years, a constant reminder that he would always be chosen last. And yet, he never stopped hoping. He held on to small victories, good grades, kind words from teachers, friendships that made him feel seen. They were tiny lifelines, a reminder that the world outside the house could value him even if his parents didn't. He learned to protect himself emotionally, to keep his heart from breaking every time he was overlooked. By the time he was 19, Ethan had built a quiet strength. The night he was kicked out wasn't a sudden storm, it was the final act in a long pattern of rejection. His parents had made it clear who they valued and who they didn't. The trash bag in his hand wasn't just clothes, it was years of ignored achievements, unacknowledged efforts, and silent heartbreak. As he thought about Kyle, Ethan didn't feel anger yet. He felt clarity. He understood the truth of his childhood. He had been denied love, not because he was unworthy, but because his parents were incapable of giving it equally. That understanding fueled something new in him, a determination not just to survive, but to succeed on his own terms. To one day prove, without argument or confrontation, that he had been enough all along. And with that thought, Ethan made a quiet promise: he would never again allow someone else to define his worth. The past had shaped him, but it would not control him. Ethan had no home, no family to turn to, and very little money. The first few nights, he slept in his old car, curling up on the seat and trying not to shiver in the cold. He told himself it was temporary, that soon he would find a place, a plan, a way to start over. But the nights stretched into weeks, and the sense of being alone pressed heavier on his chest. One evening, a call from his high school friend, Marcus, changed everything. Marcus had a small apartment with a spare couch and he offered Ethan a place to stay. It wasn't luxurious, just a living room with a thin mattress, but it was warmth, safety, and a roof over his head. For the first time in days, Ethan felt relief. He didn't thank his parents, he didn't cry, he simply accepted the help and made a silent vow to never be in a position to rely on them again. During the day, Ethan worked 2 jobs. At the diner, he served tables from dawn to mid-afternoon, keeping his head down and taking tips wherever he could. After that, he cleaned offices in the evenings, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins for minimum wage. The work was exhausting, but he pushed through, because exhaustion was better than returning to the life where he was constantly belittled. Between shifts, he attended community college classes part-time. The textbooks were heavy, the lectures long, and the assignments relentless, but he focused. Education became his escape, his way to build a future that wasn't tied to the people who had rejected him. Every page he read, every formula he learned, every essay he submitted was another step toward independence. Meanwhile, his parents remained distant. They ignored his calls, returning his belongings in boxes with no note, no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Each silent refusal strengthened Ethan's resolve. He realized that if he wanted security, respect, and stability, he had to create it himself. No one would hand it to him. At night, lying on Marcus's couch, Ethan thought about the life he wanted. He didn't want revenge yet, didn't even think about his parents' house. For now, he wanted small victories, rent paid on time, grades improving, work done well. These small wins built confidence, and slowly, hope grew alongside it. The rejection, the humiliation, the long hours, they all hardened him, but they didn't break him. Ethan began to understand that being homeless was temporary, but giving up was permanent. Every shift, every class, every scraped-together meal reminded him of one truth: he would never beg for acceptance again. He would earn his place in the world on his own terms, and when the time came, he would do it with dignity and strength. One evening, while Ethan was finishing a long shift at the diner, he noticed an older man watching him work. Marcus Reed, a contractor who had been helping the diner with small repairs, came over and struck up a conversation. He didn't lecture or criticize, he simply asked questions about Ethan's goals and listened carefully. When Ethan shared his story, Marcus didn't pity him. Instead, he recognized the determination in Ethan's eyes and offered him advice that would change everything. Marcus suggested a trade apprenticeship, something Ethan had never considered. He explained that with the right training and dedication, Ethan could build a career that would not only provide financial stability but also give him independence and pride. The offer sounded challenging, almost impossible, but Ethan felt a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. Ethan committed himself fully. He woke up before sunrise to work at the diner, then spent evenings learning the trade from Marcus. Sleep became scarce, and social life disappeared entirely. Friends invited him out, but he refused, knowing that each hour spent learning or practicing brought him closer to the life he wanted. He learned to measure, cut, and install materials with precision. He learned patience, problem-solving, and how to take pride in a job well done. While Ethan was building himself, his parents continued to spread their narrative. They told relatives that he had given up on life, that he had failed. Ethan heard some of it through whispers or accidental conversations, but he refused to be distracted. Instead of arguing or defending himself, he focused on actions. Every skill he learned, every project he completed, was a step away from the humiliation he had endured and a step toward control over his own life. The work was not easy. There were times when Ethan wanted to quit, when exhaustion and loneliness made him question whether the sacrifices were worth it. But he reminded himself that he was building something no one could take away: his independence, his confidence, and his ability to stand on his own. He began to see progress not as immediate success, but as a slow accumulation of knowledge and experience that would eventually pay off. By the end of the first year, Ethan was no longer the uncertain, overlooked young man who had been kicked out. He had skills that made him valuable, a work ethic that earned respect, and a quiet confidence that grew with every small victory. His parents' words no longer held power over him. He was no longer defined by their neglect or their favoritism toward Kyle. Through Marcus's guidance and his own relentless effort, Ethan learned a critical lesson: success is not given, it is earned. And when it comes, it carries a satisfaction that no apology or recognition from those who wronged you can replace. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt that the future was his to shape, and he intended to shape it on his own terms. Years went by, and Ethan's hard work began to pay off. After completing his apprenticeship, he became a licensed contractor. It was a title that carried respect and opportunity, but more importantly, it was proof to himself that he could succeed without anyone's help. He took on small projects at first, fixing kitchens, repairing roofs, painting walls, and each completed job built both his confidence and his reputation. Soon, Ethan saved enough to start his own small real estate renovation business. He didn't buy luxurious properties at first, he looked for old, run-down houses that no one wanted. While others saw decay and cost, Ethan saw potential. He would buy these homes, often with loans and savings he had carefully set aside, and spend weeks repairing, painting, and upgrading them with his own hands. Every nail he hammered, every wall he plastered, and every floor he refinished was a step toward independence and proof of his determination. As Ethan renovated the homes, he sold them for a profit, slowly growing his business and his savings. With every successful project, he proved to himself that the life he had been denied was possible to build on his own. He also learned to trust his instincts and skills, knowing that his effort and persistence were the reasons for his success. Meanwhile, back home, things were very different. Kyle, his younger brother, continued to rely on their parents' support. He started new ventures and business ideas, but each one failed. Their parents tried to fix Kyle's mistakes, paying bills, covering losses, and constantly reassuring him that he was talented and special. Yet, despite all their help, Kyle struggled, while Ethan thrived entirely on his own effort. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't call to prove a point or remind his parents of their past mistakes. He simply focused on his work, knowing that every project completed and every property sold was a victory earned through perseverance. He began to feel the satisfaction that comes not from recognition, but from achieving something entirely on one's own. He also began to notice how different life had become for him. He no longer worried about being overlooked or dismissed. Instead, he was respected in his community for his skills, his honesty, and his dedication. Friends and clients trusted him, and slowly, Ethan built a life that was stable, secure, and entirely his own. Despite all of this, his parents never reached out. They didn't ask about his progress, they didn't check if he needed help, and they certainly didn't apologize for the years of rejection. But Ethan no longer needed their approval. He had created something no one could take away: financial independence, respect, and a sense of pride in his accomplishments. The difference between him and Kyle was clear. Kyle had been favored, given support, and yet struggled. Ethan had been abandoned, ignored, and yet flourished. The irony was not lost on him. And deep down, Ethan knew that the greatest success wasn't just in the profits he made, but in the life he had built from nothing, entirely on his own. Years of neglect and favoritism had come full circle. Ethan's parents, Richard and Linda, who once acted untouchable, were now struggling in ways they had never imagined. Richard lost his job unexpectedly when the company downsized. It was a hard blow for a man who had always prided himself on being the provider, the one in control. Linda's health began to decline as stress, poor habits, and years of neglecting herself caught up with her. Bills started piling up. Mortgage payments were missed, and their once perfect house began to show cracks, not just in the walls, but in the stability of their lives. The house they had taken pride in, the house where they had shut Ethan out without a second thought, now carried the threat of foreclosure. For the first time, the world outside their bubble of control demanded accountability. Desperate, they reached out to Ethan. Not with apologies or concern, but with expectations. They called him for advice about money, for guidance on what to do with the house, and for assistance managing their failing finances. It was as if the years of ignoring him had never happened, as if the pain they caused carried no consequences. They assumed he would help because they believed he owed them something. Ethan listened quietly on the phone, feeling the weight of their entitlement. There was no remorse in their voices, no recognition of the years he had been abandoned. Only expectation. The same people who had once dismissed his worth now assumed he would swoop in and fix their problems. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he thought carefully about the past, the long nights sleeping in his car, the endless shifts working minimum wage, the times he had felt invisible and worthless. All those moments had built something strong inside him: independence, skill, and self-respect. For years, he had survived without them, and now they wanted him to save them without a word of gratitude. Ethan realized that this was not about revenge yet. It was about choice. He could help, but only on his terms. He could remain the powerless child they had once dismissed, or he could stand as the man he had worked hard to become. Every instinct told him that whatever he decided, it had to reflect the years of effort, patience, and sacrifice he had put into building his life. While they were panicking about the house and their failing finances, Ethan began to plan. He considered the foreclosure, the opportunity it presented, and the irony of the situation. The same house that had symbolized his rejection, the place where he had been told he'd never belong, was now within reach. For the first time, he imagined walking through that house not as a powerless child, but as someone in control, a person who had earned the right to decide what would happen next. The calls ended, leaving Ethan with silence and clarity. The roles had shifted, and he understood that life had finally offered him a chance to balance the scales. But he would act with patience, carefully, and without letting their entitlement dictate his choices. The irony was not lost on him: the people who had once had all the power were now in need, and he held the key. Ethan didn't answer their calls for help. He didn't offer advice or a sympathetic ear. Instead, he thought carefully about the situation and decided to act professionally. He knew the house, his old home, was going into foreclosure, and he saw an opportunity. Not for revenge in the cruel sense, but for fairness and control. He spent days researching the legal process for buying a house at a foreclosure auction. He read every rule, spoke with real estate professionals, and carefully prepared his bid. He chose to remain anonymous. He didn't want them to know it was him, he wanted the results to speak for themselves. On the day of the auction, Ethan felt calm. He had invested years in building his skills, saving money, and learning how to make smart decisions. Now, everything he had worked for would come into play. The auction began, and bidders called out their offers. Ethan placed his bid quietly, without emotion, focusing only on the numbers and strategy. His parents had no idea. They stayed home, anxious about the process, venting their frustration to anyone who would listen. "These ungrateful children never appreciate anything," Linda said bitterly. Richard nodded in agreement, blaming Kyle and assuming Ethan had given up, as he always believed he had. They didn't imagine for a second that the person outbidding them could be the very child they had dismissed, ignored, and thrown out years ago. Ethan watched from a distance as the auction closed. The bid was accepted. The house, the same house that had been a symbol of rejection and pain, was now legally his. He didn't celebrate. He didn't taunt them or send a message. He simply held the paperwork in his hands, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not revenge, but balance. Not humiliation, but justice for the years of neglect. He thought about what this moment meant. It wasn't just about the house, it was about reclaiming control over a part of his life that had once been defined by others. The same walls that had once closed in on him now represented opportunity and independence. He had used patience, planning, and skill to turn a painful memory into something that no one could take away. Meanwhile, his parents continued to complain, unaware of who the new owner was. They argued about the bidding, speculated about the stranger who had outmaneuvered them, and felt powerless for the first time. Irony filled the air. Years of expecting Ethan to fail had come back to them as they faced consequences for their neglect. Ethan remained distant, quiet, and professional. He had finally put himself in a position where the past could no longer control him. The door that had once slammed in his face now opened for him on his terms. And for the first time, he realized that the ultimate power didn't come from anger or revenge, it came from strategy, patience, and the ability to rise above the pain. The day of the closing arrived, and Ethan walked up the driveway with the realtor. The sun reflected off the windows of the house he had once been kicked out of, a house that had once felt like a prison and a place of rejection. He felt calm, focused, and completely in control. Years of hard work, sacrifice, and planning had led to this moment. As he stepped inside, he saw Richard and Linda standing in the living room. They froze, their eyes wide, mouths slightly open. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Shock filled the air, thick and heavy. Ethan didn't hurry. He let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it. Then Richard's face turned red, anger replacing shock. "What, how, who allowed this?" he stammered, his voice shaking. Linda looked around frantically, confusion turning into panic. They had assumed a stranger had bought the house, someone they didn't know. They had no idea that the person standing calmly in front of them was their own son, the one they had thrown out without a second thought. Ethan set down the paperwork on the kitchen counter and looked at them steadily. "This isn't revenge," he said quietly, his voice firm but calm. "This is consequence." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You told me to leave that night. You said I didn't deserve to be here, and you slammed the door on me. I survived. I worked hard. I built a life on my own." He watched their expressions shift, first to disbelief, then to shame. Linda's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. Richard opened his mouth but couldn't find words. Ethan continued, "I didn't buy this house to hurt you. I bought it because it was mine to reclaim. I wanted to show myself, and now that neglect, rejection, and favoritism cannot define me." The irony was clear. The same parents who had once held all the power now felt powerless. Their entitlement, their assumption that Ethan would always be dependent on them, was gone. For the first time, they realized the cost of their actions. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or insult. He didn't even gloat. He simply stood tall, calm, and collected, the man he had become after years of struggle and determination. The house, once a symbol of rejection, now represented his strength and independence. As the realtor finalized the paperwork, Ethan glanced around the rooms he had once been forced to leave. He remembered the fear, the anger, and the tears of that night, and he allowed himself a quiet sense of closure. He had turned the past into an opportunity, and in doing so, he had taken control of the life that had once been stolen from him. Richard and Linda didn't speak. They couldn't. Ethan's presence, calm and steady, reminded them of everything they had lost through their neglect. He had not sought revenge, but the lesson had been delivered. And for Ethan, that was enough. Ethan watched as his parents stood in the living room, still trying to process what had just happened. He felt the weight of years of neglect and rejection behind him, but he didn't let it turn into anger or cruelty. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that he was in control now. This was his moment, and he would act with dignity. "I'll give you time to move out," he said calmly. 2 weeks. "That's fair, and it's enough to make arrangements." His voice was steady. There was no yelling, no insults, no accusations. Just clear boundaries. For the first time, he felt the true meaning of power, not domination, not revenge, but the ability to make decisions without fear, guided by principle rather than emotion. Richard's jaw tightened. We didn't expect this," he said quietly, avoiding Ethan's eyes. Linda's voice trembled as she tried to apologize. "Ethan, I'm sorry for everything. I didn't realize," her words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of the years they had ignored him. Ethan listened without interrupting. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, but inside, he knew that some wounds were too deep for words alone to fix. He didn't need validation or reconciliation to feel whole. He had built a life, earned respect, and gained independence on his own. The apology was theirs to give, and he accepted it without letting it change his own sense of self-worth. Over the next 2 weeks, his parents packed their belongings quietly. Ethan checked in just enough to ensure the process was smooth but stayed firm in his boundaries. He didn't micromanage, he didn't lecture. He simply reminded them of the timeline and allowed them to take responsibility for themselves. During that time, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. The boy who had been kicked out, ignored, and overlooked was now the man who held the keys to his future, and to the house that had once symbolized rejection. He had chosen to act with integrity, proving that strength was not measured by anger or revenge, but by patience, self-control, and clear boundaries. When his parents finally left the house, the silence was heavy but not bitter. Ethan walked through the rooms, remembering the nights of despair and the years of struggle. Instead of rage, he felt clarity. He had claimed what was rightfully his, not out of malice, but because he had earned it. Standing in the living room, he realized the greatest lesson of all: true power is never about hurting others. It's about standing firm, protecting yourself, and choosing how to respond. Ethan had all of that now. The past could not define him anymore. He had the house, the life, and, most importantly, the dignity he had fought so hard to achieve. After his parents finally left, Ethan walked through the house alone. It was quiet, filled only with memories, some painful, some lingering from better times. He didn't rush to renovate immediately. Instead, he paused, taking in the space that had once been the center of his rejection. Every scratch on the floor, every faded wall reminded him of the nights he had spent feeling invisible, of the harsh words and slammed doors. Ethan began work slowly, carefully, and deliberately. He patched holes in the walls, repainted rooms, and replaced broken fixtures. The process was methodical, almost meditative. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about reclaiming it. Each improvement symbolized control, independence, and the power to rebuild something on his own terms. While working, Ethan often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the nights sleeping in his car, the endless shifts, the quiet hours spent learning a trade, and the years of determination that had shaped him. He realized that every act of betrayal, every word of neglect, and every dismissal had strengthened him in ways he hadn't appreciated at the time. What could have broken him instead became the foundation for his resilience. As the house began to transform, so did Ethan's perspective. He felt pride, but not pride born of arrogance. He felt gratitude for his own strength, for the people who had supported him along the way, like Marcus, and for the lessons he had learned. The house was no longer a symbol of pain, it was a testament to perseverance and self-reliance. Finally, after weeks of work, the renovation was complete. Every room reflected effort and care, every corner spoke of determination. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking around, and felt a deep sense of closure. He walked through the house slowly, imagining the life he would live here, not for revenge, not for validation, but because he had earned it. When he reached the front door, he paused, hand on the lock. For the first time, he understood the full meaning of choice. He could lock the door to keep others out, but more importantly, he could lock the door to signify the end of a chapter in his life. Slowly, he turned the key. The sound was symbolic, a quiet finality. He wasn't escaping the past, he was acknowledging it, honoring his journey, and stepping fully into the life he had built. Ethan smiled, not out of triumph over others, but out of satisfaction with himself. The house, the struggles, and the years of pain had all led to this moment. He had survived betrayal, neglect, and rejection. He had grown, learned, and become someone stronger, wiser, and independent. Locking the door behind him, he didn't look back. The past was a memory, not a chain. Success wasn't measured by the house he now owned, but by the person he had become. The boy who had been thrown out had grown into a man who could stand whole, strong, and free.